Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We're going to just wait a couple more minutes as people continue to join, and then we'll kick off. Hello, everyone. My name is Kristin Hanczor, and I'm the Senior Partnership Manager at the Green Sports Alliance. On behalf of the entire Alliance team, we hope you are all staying safe and healthy, and we thank you for joining us today for our third session of our Earth Month webinar series, which we're doing in partnership with the Sport Ecology Group. And this session is This Is Not a Drill, How Climate Change is Impacting Sports. We also have our project coordinator, Jessica Crawford, with us today, who will be posting live updates on our social media channels during the discussion, so you can keep an eye out for those. And we have closed captioning brought to you by LNS Captioning. We thank them for their services as partners of the Alliance. Before we begin, a few quick housekeeping items. First, we will be making both the slide decks and the webinar recording available following today's session, and we'll be sending a follow-up email to all the attendees with access to these. Also, just in case you have not seen our announcement a couple of weeks ago, we are rescheduling the Green Sports Alliance 2020 Summit for a later date as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. More details will be coming soon and will be available on the Summit website, but you can feel free to reach out to myself or other members of the Alliance with any questions. Here is the full list of webinars we have been co-hosting with the Sport Ecology Group this month, leading up to Earth Day on April 22nd. Our final webinar in the series will be next Monday, April 20th, and you can register at the Sport Ecology Group website, and this link will be included in the follow-up email. All these webinars are recorded and available to the public, so feel free to reach out if you've missed one and would like to watch the recording. Also, just want to flag that on Earth Day itself, which is next Wednesday, April 22nd, we will be hosting a digital resource fair where we'll be releasing 50 curated green sports resources in honor of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. They will all be available for free for a month on the Sport Ecology Group's website, and this link will also be included in the follow-up email. One last point before we jump in is that there will be time for Q&A with our speakers after they each provide a brief overview of their work. So we encourage you to type in any questions into the chat box throughout the session, and we'll do our best to cover as many submitted questions as we can. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first guest, Dr. Doug Casas, CEO of the Korey Stringer Institute and Professor of Kinesiology at the University of Connecticut. Doug, thanks for joining us today and for kicking off the session.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I've had the honor of working at University of Connecticut for the last 20 years, and Korey Stringer Institute was founded 10 years ago. Korey Stringer was an NFL football player who sadly died from exertional heat stroke back in 2001. He was an all-pro offensive lineman for the Minnesota Vikings and died during an extreme heat wave heat stroke suffered during training practices. At the Korey Stringer Institute, we have 80 employees, there's 20 staff and 60 volunteers, and we work very hard to try to enhance performance and safety for the athlete, warfighter, and laborer who have to do intense exercise in the heat So we're constantly looking at either research or policies or advocacy to try to make things safer for the athlete, warfighter, and laborer. Next slide. So a lot of what we do is to try to help sports governing bodies or do research that would impact sports governing bodies. And just to kind of remind everyone of some of the extreme heat that we're facing or have faced in recent and soon to be sporting events. Think just about the Olympics of 2020 for Tokyo, which we now know will be 2021. But think about the heat that they're going to face late July, early August. Traditionally is brutally hot and very humid in Tokyo. And that's not even just factoring in climate change. Back in 1964, when Tokyo hosted the Olympics, they moved it to October because of the extreme heat concerns back then. And now here we are in 2021 next year. It's going to be in late July and early August. And the temperature is almost 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer now on those same days than it was back then, just from climate change. So we're facing still the same brutal humidity, warmer conditions, and it's going to be happening 2 months earlier than previously. So you can imagine the extreme stress or concerns. So I work with the IOC right now to try to come up with strategies with timing of events and different things to try to keep it safe for the athletes. But obviously venue selection is going to be very important in the future when we consider these events. You may remember that the IAAF, which is now known as World Athletics, had their World Championships in Qatar in the Middle East this past late September and early October. So they had the marathon running at midnight for the men and women's marathon, and the race walks were happening at midnight because of the brutal events. And they air conditioned, yes, air conditioned their outdoor track stadium to try to keep it in the mid 70s at like level of about 3 feet high for the people competing in the track. The Women's World Cup was brutally hot this past summer in France. You may know that Paris recorded some of its hottest temperatures in history. Qatar is going to be hosting the World Cup in 2022. They had to move it to December because it's typically in July. The Paris has the Olympics for 2024. LA has it for 2028. Both could be extremely hot in the traditional early August dates. And then you could see some of the other traditional events and venues that are also going to be quite hot. I didn't even list it here, but the World Cup for 2026, America is hosting with Mexico and Canada. And there's going to be some of the venues are extremely warm weather places. So we already face some brutally hot conditions because a lot of the biggest sports like Olympics and World Cup traditionally happen during the summer to start with. And now you're facing even warmer conditions. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the World Championships this past year occurred at midnight. We had to do the marathon, and we had to do a lot of modifications to try to make sure that athletes were safe. And so we already face a lot of warm conditions, and these are obviously only going to become more challenging. Next slide. We recently published a paper in the Journal of Athletic Training where we specifically looked at the weather conditions of all the previous World Cups and Olympic Games. And we compared them to the Tokyo 2020 speculated weather conditions and the speculated weather conditions for the World Cup in Qatar in 2022, just to get an idea of what we would be facing. And our findings indicated that the Tokyo 2020 Summer Olympics and obviously now 2021 we predict will be the hottest Summer Olympics in history. So it creates a lot of unique challenges. One thing as an example, they're moving the marathon to a city that's 6 hours north of Tokyo because of, to try to make it a little bit cooler because it's so oppressive there. So it'll be the first time in history where the marathon's not run in the actual Olympic city. A lot of other changes being made to times of when events are taking place and things like that. Next slide. We also just published, this was about a week ago, in the journal Temperature, 2020, we published this paper that took a more in-depth look of specifically the different climatological issues of all the different sports that are going to be participated in the Tokyo 2021 games. You can go to the next slide to show an example. Here you can see the average weather conditions, and you just get an idea of how oppressive this is. Look at the average relative humidity in the hours of the day when we're looking at August weather. So you're talking about humidity in the 80s and 90% for a big chunk of the day, and average high temperatures that are around 30 degrees Celsius for also a big chunk of the day. We're talking like 7, 8, 9 hours, it's over 30 degrees Celsius. So when you combine those for WEPO globe temperature, you're looking at very oppressive conditions, which you need to consider. Next slide. This is just a sampling of some of the sports that are in the Olympic Games. You can get an idea, like for one that concerns us a lot would be like road cycling, because the intensity is so high and the risk of heat stroke would be ever present. And you see that 45% of the time they're actually going to be out there between 12 and 3. And there are other events, obviously, like the marathon, mountain biking, triathlon, other sports that have great concern with the high temperatures and humidities. So I just wanted to give an overview of some of the high profile sports that are consistently, having to take place in the heat. And now we're obviously going to be, in the years to come, facing more oppressive conditions when these activities have to take place. So I can address some questions when everyone else has had a chance to speak.
Thank you, Doug, for that great introduction and showing some of the intensity of the challenge that we are facing. So I will now pass things off to Jonathan Smith, Executive Director of the GEO Foundation, to give us a closer look at the environmental impacts specific to the golf industry. So Jonathan, over to you.
Okay, and thank you very much, Kristin, and thanks also to the Sport Ecology group for inviting us to join today. I think first and foremost, I'd like to send very best wishes to everybody on the call from Scotland in these times of concern and disruption, and just to express a little bit of solidarity with everybody else that's out there today. And then just diving into a quick introduction to the GEO Foundation and our work, which is non-profit and dedicated to helping accelerate sustainability in and through golf. We've been doing this for around about 14 years now, with three main purposes. First of all, to try and strengthen golf's environmental and social contribution, so to build on the good work and the value that golf already provides in sustainability, but to try and extend that and accelerate it further, in particular to meet some of these new challenges, such as accelerating climate change. To use that real value that golf brings, so the progress and the results that golf generates, to help enhance its image and reputation, so to tell the story of a sport that is adapting and is pushing the boundaries in sustainability. And through that, from being able to sort of walk the walk and talk the talk, our hope is that golf can become a sport which truly engages and inspires a wider audience. It has a huge following. It's a very influential sport, and we believe, we're passionate about the idea that golf becomes a leader in sustainable sport and in sustainability in communities, and also through the media. Next point. We've tried to break sustainability down into something that is digestible and practical and understandable to the golf sector, and also material, so it's very relevant to what issues golf faces. So we've boiled that down into a simple sustainability agenda of fostering nature, conserving resources, supporting communities, and climate action. That agenda has about 12 action areas itself and tracks to around about 8 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, a sort of priority 8, a top tier, as well as a number of secondary UN SDGs that golf does affect, but maybe not so directly. And then in terms of our activities, the foundation, we spend our time campaigning and advocating for sustainability in and through golf. We're very much focused on the risks that sustainability and inaction presents to the golf sector. We'd like to spend more time actually talking about the opportunities for the growth and image and profitability and success of golf. And actually, I guess maybe our main passion lies in the societal need and what we could see a sport like golf delivering to communities and to the environment. We carry that advocacy out into support and recognition, so programs very much partnership driven. We call them the on-course programs for sustainable golf, and there's also a GEO-certified labeling system. And then through using software, we try and gather and track as many results, data and stories that come out of those programs, and turn those into promotion and knowledge sharing, and sharing the results within the golf industry and externally. And finally, at any one given point in time, we're running research and innovation projects. It could be natural capital, ecosystem services, climate action, sustainability metrics and reporting. So there's always something on the back burner that we're trying to think about in advance of it becoming of benefit or a necessity to the industry. Next slide. Very quickly, you could just run through these, Kristin, just put them all up on screen, I guess, for time. We've broken golf down into 3 subsectors where we try and develop those programs and roll out into the industry to try and support and recognise and have impact. There are 34,000 grassroots golf clubs and courses around the world, of which about 15,000 are in the United States. So those are grassroots, often community-based golf courses, municipal courses as well. So from 6-star resorts to 6-hole pay and plays, as we say. And there's an opportunity for all of them to really embrace sustainability and build it into their operations and their development plans and their marketing and staff engagement, and to really forces for good and agents for change within their own landscapes and communities. We're also obviously interested in tournaments. They have environmental impact, like all temporary events. There are many of them on various tours around the world, and we want to try and help accelerate a movement in sustainable golf tournaments, trying to make that as practical as possible. So looking at simple approaches to venue selection, temporary staging issues, transportation, fuel, waste, supply chains, etc., and then taking it out to fan engagement and communications, and also looking at the legacies. And there's a few of the tournaments that we're working with there, but a number of others on the PGA Tour, like the AT&T events at Pebble Beach and the Byron Nelson, the LPGA, now interested on the back of the work at the Dow Great Lakes Bay Invitational last year, which is really helping to accelerate that on the LPGA. The Omega European Masters in Switzerland, starting to position themselves as a leader in that space. And then finally, the third area that we look at and try and take our work into is new golf development. And really what we're interested here is in showcasing how a new golf facility can not only embrace sustainability and be more resilient and deliver more value as a result, but also go on to be a force for good. So here we're looking beyond the ropes, as we would say in golf, out into the wider community, and how that investment in golf can really be a multiplier and a legacy for good in a whole host of ways, a number of which are actually linked to adaptation to climate, which I'll talk about later on in the webinar. And finally, from introduction, so on the subject today, talking about the impacts of climate and golf, it is a landscape, environmentally based sport. It is played outdoors, so it's no surprise that there are a number of issues generated by linked to climate and concerns linked to climate change, which are affecting golf to greater or lesser degrees depending on the region and depending on the part of golf. So I will run through some of these, some examples of these over the course of the webinar, about how things like flooding in the Houston area over the last few years with Hurricane Harvey and Tropical Storm Imelda, some of the impacts that's having, storms impacting, seeming, although it's not scientifically proven, but seeming to increase in terms of impact on tournaments and tournament delays. We've certainly seen bad weather impacting the number of playing rounds in certain regions. I can actually cite a case from Glasgow where the weather is not always that good, but it seems to have got worse in terms of the number of golfing days played in Glasgow, which has gone down by 20% in the last 10 years between 2006 and 2016, most of which is apparently linked to poor weather and storms and flooding and saturation of courses. There's a number of examples of drought. I think most notably around the world, the Californian drought between 2014 and 17, and the impact that that had on golf. And actually it was one of the first examples at scale where we saw golf beginning to adapt to that particular issue. Significantly, the golf industry, I think, mobilized itself very quickly there to naturalize, to reduce irrigation demand, and really to try and wrestle with big issue, and that's actually proving to be a little bit of a model for other parts of the world, like South Africa, where of course they faced day zero last year around Cape Town, and that has a big impact on a sport like golf. So I'll touch on some other examples as we go through the webinar, but I'll leave it there as for introduction for now.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next up is Dr. Nick Wantanabe, Assistant Professor of Sport and Entertainment Management at the University of South Carolina, to introduce concepts on the economics surrounding the two-way relationship that exists between the environment and sports. Nick, over to you.
Thank you. First, I'll say thank you to everyone for being here, as well as to have me on board. And I'd like to also reflect my thoughts and concerns for everyone in the current times. So what I do is a lot of the economics of sport from an environmental lens. And we sort of look at this in two directions. And we can go ahead to the next slide. So basically, what we have is there's this complex relationship existing between sport and the environment. And we know that the environment is affecting sport from what our previous speakers have said so far. But we also know that sport is affecting the environment. So there's a growing literature and evidence from academic researchers and sport organizations showing that sport does have an impact on the environment. I like to point out this paper by Humphreys, who's my advisor at West Virginia University in Pune, that finds that the more attendees you have at Major League Baseball games, it basically creates more traffic, to about $7 million in CO2 emissions costs for host cities each year. So if we think about that, that's just one small piece of a bigger understanding of this fact that sport leads to traffic, and traffic is going to create pollution. So I think there's importance in considering sort of both directions of how the environment affects sport and how sport affects the environment. If we can go to the next slide. So we have some quick examples here, and this isn't the whole literature, but it's actually a significant amount of it. There's still not too many studies. On the top, we can see the impact of sport on the environment. So Locke has this piece in Contemporary Economic Policy. He finds that the more attendees are at a Major League Baseball game, then so does the level of ozone, which is the primary component of smog, also increase. We have this other paper by Bunds, Casper, and some of their colleagues in event management, and they actually wore these air quality monitor, I believe, backpacks around college football games. And they can detect very high emission levels on college game day related activities, such as trucks passing by, grills, etc. And then the flip side is, this is a paper I wrote with some colleagues, is that we try to look at sort of this opposite direction. And we sort of find, actually, curiously, in China, we find that air pollution levels didn't affect attendance at matches. And people will say, oh, that's good, but it's actually quite bad in terms of a health implication, because it sort of tells us, well, if fans aren't responsive, they could potentially be putting themselves at danger by attending games. At the same time, there's also this Archsmith paper that shows that umpires commit more errors, and thus, when there's higher air pollution, and thus we can probably see that there's some kind of cognitive effect as well, not just a physical effect from the impact of pollution on sport. If we go to the next slide. So what we're doing is trying to think about the future and how we're going to examine these relationships. So I like to frame a lot of these as the potential negative externalities that are created by the sport industry. This goes back to that Humphreys and Pune paper that finds that social costs that come about from hosting Major League Baseball games. And so we're currently working on more research along these lines, such as we found that NFL games tend to about 4 times greater level of pollution per attendee than MLB games. You may note that, okay, there's less NFL games than Major League Baseball games, but if we're doing it at a per attendee analysis, we're saying that NFL has a higher social cost, and then trying to figure out, well, why is that, or how do we mitigate it? So this brings the interesting question about how can the sport industry recognize and reduce the environmental impact they're having. It also basically points to how do we improve measurement and monitoring environmental impacts. One proposal is from Dr. McCullough, Dr. Orr, and myself in using the direct and external environmental impact framework. That's actually in preprint at Journal of Sport Management. I'm going to keep it here so we can keep rolling along and get to questions. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Nick. And last but not least, we have Dr. Madi Europe, co-director of the Sport Ecology Group and assistant professor at SUNY Cortland, to talk about her research in climate vulnerability and adaptation across a range of sporting events. Maddy, you're up.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for being a part of this today. And this is our third in 4 webinars in this series. And thanks to the Green Sports Alliance for generously partnering with the Sport Ecology Group on this project in the series. We're excited about it, and it's been a lot of fun so far. So I am a climate vulnerability researcher in the sport sector, and what that typically means is I study what is at risk and what do we do about it. Next slide. The scope of the problem, and I'll be fast about this slide because there's been so many good examples brought up so far, but I'll round it out with some examples from other sports that have not been mentioned. Part of the problem with climate change is it's going to affect every sport and every sport organization within that sport very differently. And that has to do with a number of factors, and we'll get into that in just a second. But every sport has to recognize its own points of vulnerability. And we can start doing that by looking back at how things have changed since the 1970s, when we started to get our early models of what climate change would mean. And so, for example, with skating, we've lost 1 day of skatable outdoor ice in the north, so Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Northeast, and then Canada since the 1970s. It works out to about a day a year. With baseball, we have an unpredictable early season. Last year, for example, there were a number of rained out games in the early season, and then you hit the high heat and humidity index in the summer, and towards the end of the summer, you get right into that wildfire season and that hurricane season in the Southeast. And so there's a number of challenges that baseball faces throughout its season. Part of that is how long it is. Part of that is that it's outdoors. Football has some of the same challenges. Heat in the early season is an issue. And I know Doug already mentioned a lot of heat research, so I'll be brief on that. But once you move into the fall, you're getting into wildfire season in the West, and again, storms in the East. And then skiing, the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, early closures have been an issue for the last few years, especially, I mean, this year it's COVID-19, but in past, ski mountains have been closed early because of a lack of snow. And there's trouble with making and keeping snow. And so when it comes to a ski mountain, you can create snow with snowmakers, but you do need the temperature to sit right around that freezing point in order for that snow to stick. And if it doesn't do that, then your snow machines are no good. And there's been a number of mechanisms for challenging or meeting these challenges. But as we move forward, we're going to have to start addressing these challenges in every sport as they become more prominent. Next slide. So with climate vulnerability, the most basic equation that we use to assess how vulnerable an organization is we use climate impacts on the organization. So what hazards will the organization face? How likely is each type of hazard and how bad will it be? Minus the organizational capacity of the organization in question. And so essentially that means how bad are the risks are and subtract how prepared are you. The way this equation works, if your capacity to respond to the threats that you're facing is stronger than the threats themselves. And so if you're super prepared and you've got a plan B and you have a secondary date planned, or perhaps you have an alternative schedule or an alternative location for the event in case of a rain delay or a fire or what have you, then you are more prepared than the hazard itself. And in that case, you are in a place of resilience. And so the goal with my research is to move organizations into positions of being resilient and less vulnerable. Next slide. like I said, every organization is going to have a different set of challenges, and there's a number of factors that will influence the hazards that they face. And so and this seems pretty straightforward, I think, for most people, but the location is the biggest one. Different parts of even just North America are facing very, very different challenges. If you're in the Midwest, you might recall some serious flooding incidents over the last couple of years. If you're on the East Coast, you might have noticed that we've had more 500-year storms in the last few years than were ever supposed to happen over the next 20. If you're in the Rockies, you may have noticed that the snow patterns are changing. So depending on your location, your hazards will be different. The season of play is another big factor. If you're a summer sport and there's no room to move into the fall or spring, that could compromise your flexibility a little bit. The type of hazard, and then the type of sport. If you're outdoor, indoor, if you have a team sport or an individual sport, typically individual sports are a little more flexible because you're not moving tons and tons of people, you're moving one person. And so there's a little more flexibility there. Next slide. And then finally, most of my research lately has looked at the factors that influence organizations' readiness to respond. Again, it depends on the hazards you're facing, but what I'm starting to learn is there is a lot to be said for numbers 1 and 2. If you have a contingency budget and you've got really good relationship with your insurer, and then you've got a team that's aware of the problem and willing to participate in trainings and protocol development and procedural development, that really goes a long way. And often that is enough to insulate the organization in the short term against major climate shocks. But in some cases, there is more that's needed. And so that may look like a renegotiation of media contracts to make sure that you can build in extra breaks. If you're playing a sport that needs a water break, it may look like new relationships with sponsors that can provide resources that are necessary, like more cooling towels as an example. Another example would be big air handlers or new air handlers for the building that might improve the quality of AC. And there's a number of different items that can be done there with networks. And then infrastructure and natural resources. Can you plant more native plants on the property that would capture some more rain, and then that would improve your capacity to respond to flooding, for example. So the further you get into this 1 through 6, the more intensive it tends to be to make it happen, to be more prepared. But this tends to be the order in which organizations progress when they look at being more ready for responding to climate hazards. Next slide. Currently, my work thinking about climate vulnerability has focused on a few sports as I tackle this in the first instance. So cross-country skiing and baseball have been very exposed over the last 30 years and will continue to be exposed moving into the next 50 years. So using IPCC projections, that's the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, we're able to start tracing what exactly the impacts will be, what facilities will be safe and not safe, what they might do to respond. We have just started collecting data and working through marathons, surfing, and American football, and we'll hopefully be publishing that later this summer, some of my colleagues and I. The consequences of a climate hazard-induced event cancellation is another big item that I've been looking at recently, and this is something that has some bearing on COVID-19 cancellations. We have been tracing how flexible and willing to change their plans the different clienteles are for different sports. And so what we've learned is that more invested fans are less likely to want an alternative date or an alternative schedule or an alternative location. But bandwagon fans don't care as much. So the more we learn about what fans are willing to do and how flexible they are, and then how flexible partners and media are, the more we can learn about the consequences of cancellations and the consequences of climate change. And last, most recently, we have started exploring, Tim Kellison and I, the rationales for early stadium replacement. And the big one there is typically stadiums get replaced on a regular rotation every 20, 30 years or so. More recently, we've seen hurried replacement. And so that means organizations that are looking to get a new stadium faster than they otherwise would. And what's starting to happen is some teams are saying these climate challenges are a good rationale for a new stadium. And in some cases, that's a really good rationale. It makes a lot of sense. And in some cases, it doesn't make so much sense, and it's a bit of a stretch. So how do we debunk the notion that climate change is a big threat in areas where it's not? And how do we hurry the awareness and increase the urgency in areas where climate change absolutely is a problem? Next slide. So I'll leave it there, and we'll get into some Q&A, and I'm happy to take questions with the others as we go. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Maddy, and to all of our speakers for your perspectives. And unfortunately, looking at a potential pretty scary future of sports in the changing climate, but of course talking about how necessary it is for sports to find ways to not only quickly but effectively address these. So we will dive into all of that a little bit more in the Q&A section. Just to remind all of our listeners, you can type in your question in the box on the side of your screen, and we will see them come through. We'll try to get through as many as we can. So to kick things off, I'm going to start first with a question for the group. Can you share a specific example of a successful climate mitigation strategy that has been implemented at whether it be a major sporting event or within a large sports venue, and maybe how it was successful? So I'll start with Jonathan first, if you don't mind kicking off that question.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so finding, I think seeing real cradle to cradle examples of that, really comprehensive approaches is a bit difficult. I mean, all I can say is over the last few years, I've been impressed by a number of the things that, for example, UEFA did around the European Championships in 2016. Where they had a pretty comprehensive approach to climate going into the event, and they also broke some new ground in terms of carbon mitigation and offsetting, etc. I know that in venues, places like the Johan Cruyff Arena in Amsterdam have been sort of gradually building resilience and climate adaptation throughout all of the impressive technology that they've invested into the arena. I know that cricket is looking at that at a lot of the main areas. Roland Garros, also in France, have been very heavy on this. In golf, just briefly, we've seen some interesting sort of, I wouldn't say comprehensive adaptations, but the beginnings of adaptations, and I think these will be more planned in the future. Things like the US Open at Chambers Bay in 2015, where heat is an issue. St Andrews in 2015, where a day of play at that major was lost due to high winds and storm damage. And then to Maddy's point about how this affects different parts of sports differently in different areas, and each sport, and people having to do their own risk assessments, I've been interested to see things like the US Kids Golf Foundation, the Venice Open, which is a children's event in northern Italy, and the Portuguese Golf Federations. They've all started to adapt the way that they run, particularly junior and family golf events, because it's taking people outdoors, as Doug says, at certain times of the day in heat. So looking at how those are staged, the format of the tournaments, the hydration, the shade, the player briefings, the sort of health and safety for players around that. I think some of the most interesting guidelines have actually been coming out of the amateur game within the golf industry.
Great. And Maddy or Doug or Nick, have any other maybe examples that you've worked on or seen that have been successful mitigation strategies?
Yeah, I've seen a couple really interesting ones coming out of university athletic programs in the West, where because of the increased risk of wildfires, they have partnered with regionally proximate high schools or public facilities as a Plan B venue. And so, for example, with Stanford, they faced some issues a couple of years ago with the big campfire where it affected some of their soccer season and a big tournament that they were actually meant to host. And their solution to that, and it was pretty easy to do because they had some of these relationships already, was, well, we can't host it on campus, but 100 miles further down the coast, they're less affected. The air quality is sufficiently safe, and we can move quite easily there. We know the venue, we've scoped it out. And so they were able to do that quite easily. Having those partnerships is something that you may not ever need it, but when you need it and you have it, it's huge. So hats off to them for being proactive about that.
I'll just quickly add in that in Europe and in like Qatar, they have rail passes that come with football tickets basically for free to try to get people to not use transport that creates a lot of pollution and use public transport instead, which I think is a great idea if we're trying to avoid emissions. This seems to be a great idea and hopefully would start catching on in the US.
Yeah, those are some great examples. And off of that, a couple of questions that I'll try to pull together into one is, given the environmental footprint of major events and venues, is there a need for, whether it be federal or global policies to manage this footprint? And if so, what guidelines do we need and how should they be developed? So a big question there combines a couple of things that people are asking. But Nick, I'll start with you to see what kind of guidelines do we really need to address the environmental impact of these major events?
Well, this is a very good question because there's also, I guess the first question would be, whose job is this? Is this the city, state, federal, or is this a sport organization, league, or a combination of those and other stakeholders? Whose job is it to create sort of a policy in terms of that environmental footprint, like how much emissions can come from a game? And then it also rolls into that next question about basically, should there also be policies that protect the athletes and spectators? The Korean Football Association has a AQI, I believe it's 250 or 300 policy that when the air pollution goes above those levels, games are called off. And I think it's only them and maybe Alberta that has such policies, but there may be others. So it would be curious to see if others would start to build these kind of policies. And I think they're necessary because we can see that we do not want sport events happening when there's already high levels of pollution because it's just adding to it, right? It's making the problem even worse. So there's definitely probably actually several layers of policy that needs to be created. And I do think, from my opinion, that it's something that needs to be both federal, state, and sport league driven to basically help the environment and the health of fans, athletes, staff, and so forth.
Anyone else want to jump in on that piece before we move on?
I might suggest that we have federal global policies and guidelines on a number of other aspects in sport, not necessarily global, but certainly federal, and within each sport organization, there are rules around rain policies. Lightning often has policies associated with it. And so it may not be necessarily the case that the whole NCAA or the whole of the country would need to have a policy for wildfire, but certainly the Pac-12, for example, should have a policy for wildfire, and any major league that has operations that would cover that area should consider a policy for wildfire. And so again, it's a place-by-place basis. Federal is tough unless you're a smaller country. North America is huge, but again, and I know that Doug mentioned this at the beginning and Nick touched on it a moment ago, it has to harken back to the health of the athlete and the fan. If people's health is at risk, that's a huge problem, and there needs to be a policy for that.
Could I briefly add, Kristin, just that I think there's a lot of guidance out around sport at the moment about developing sustainability policies and sustainability strategy for different sports. I mean, the IOC launched, I thought, a really useful document about, I think it's like 10 steps to sustainability strategy for sports associations. But I think, one of the elements that's in this webinar that's, having a light shone on it which is part of sustainability, obviously, is the risk assessment side. How is climate change going to impact your sport and the events and the facilities from the grassroots, through to the major events? And I think that is a little bit, from my experience, a little bit of a sort of dark space that could do with this methodology and could do with this light shone on it, so that as people are evolving and further developing their sustainability policies and strategies, that this is really taken into account, because this actually could drive some of the timescales and urgency around elements of adaptation and becoming more sustainable.
Great, thank you for that. We're also seeing, not surprisingly, a couple of questions around the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the sports industry at the moment. And so almost all major sporting events have been postponed, and the sports industry is being forced to really address some of these concerns financially, medically, looking at the health of facilities. So how can we keep climate and climate mitigation as a priority for sports organizations as they're looking to reopen? They have a bit more time, the Olympics, as Doug mentioned, being pushed to next year. How can we as a greening sports organization and movement help to make sure that the issues of climate stay top of mind? As right now, maybe the issues of this global pandemic are maybe taking up most of times. So I'm going to see if Doug, would you mind start with the answer to that not easy and very complicated question?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm actually very concerned for when we resume sports, and the fact of, from a heat safety perspective, in that we may be resuming sports like in a July-August range, where it could be the hottest weather of the year, and we may have people coming in who are not, appropriately heat acclimatized, and going right back to high-level sport. Their fitness level might not be what it was before, and they might have certain lingering health issues if they had to deal with COVID, before coming back. So there are some very specific heat issues. We've been in contact with people from the NCAA, different high school sports federations, and other individuals as they're considering the phase back to sports strategy, and what are the specific things we need to consider that we've never had to consider before. Because you think of like an athlete, let's just say any athlete who's going to be competing in the middle of July, normally they will have competed in, May, June into July, and they'll have, gradually got themselves heat acclimatized, but now they might literally just be thrust back in within maybe just a week or two preparation. And so the risk could be very different than what we've seen previously.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, just briefly, Kristin. So I would be concerned, again, talking from our experience in golf, that when sports re-emerge, that there'll be so much focus on the logistical aspects of getting the sports back up and running again, and the financial, re-emergence of the sport, that this might get looked over. I think what is encouraging, though, is that we are seeing a number of associations and leagues and teams, clubs in our sector, and hopefully this would be similar across other sports, where those associations are taking the opportunity now to think about how they're going to re-emerge. So they maybe have a window of opportunity to drill down deeper on their sustainability policies and strategies, making them more integral into what that sport will represent and what value it will offer to sponsors and governments and so on. So I think that is encouraging, that people are taking the chance now to revisit those strategies while they have a chance to do that. And hopefully that will come through as integral in the re-emergence of the sports.
And on that as well, when we're looking, obviously, Jonathan, your focus on the golf industry, there are a couple questions that have come in about how sports can work across different sectors, different regions, to address some of these similar climate issues that they'll be facing. And I know here at the Green Sports Alliance, we really try to bring together all types of sports. And I know every day we're trying to build out what sport means and broaden what that term includes and the groups that we're working with. But can maybe starting with you, Jonathan, if you talk with representatives in representing other sports, either around the country or around the world, and how we can encourage more collaboration for sports to work together on these issues. And I'll also open that up to the rest of the speakers.
I think that it feels like that is crystallizing a bit after a few years of the sustainable sport community wrestling a little bit with about what's common between across sport and what's specific to individual sports. I think that's been difficult to sort of harmonize efforts in some ways. But I do think that a lot of the sustainable sport community's work recently has, started to become much more crystallized in terms of the relevance of one sport's approach over another, or the methodology that Nick and Maddy have been working on, for risk assessment things, that is relevant to any, and it can be applied anywhere. So I think that the conversation's been there, but the ability to see the commonalities and to come up with common solutions, it feels like it's cementing a bit. Again, in the golf sector, to take that into our space, we see a lot of more collaboration around sustainability, probably less so around things like climate impacts. Although, if you look at the US, the GCSA, the Superintendents Association, the American Society of Golf Architects, the USJ, I mean, they've started to coordinate their research, education, and case study development around this, the specific topic of climate impacts more effectively. So, if you go to the SGCA website, you will see a lot of golf facilities in the United States that are renovating and adapting to that blend that they're being hit with between drought and flooding, so too much water and too little water. And how are they changing those golf landscapes to adapt to both extremes? And there's some really great case studies there, which, of course, can be applied wherever those climate extremes of drought and flooding are emerging. What we are also seeing, finally, and then I'll be quiet, sorry, is that this is also forcing a sport like golf to connect with other stakeholders, community groups, governments, urban planners. And I think that's really exciting when it gets to that stage, because it opens up all sorts of opportunities for a sport like golf to add even more value. You kind of really go beyond what it thought it could deliver into providing, much broader solutions to society.
Great, thank you for that. And just because we're coming close on time, I want to jump into a final question for everyone. For the audience who may be listening and trying to figure out what they can do with this very complex issue, maybe starting with Maddy on what resources are available to sports venues, organizations, and sporting event organizers to look at the climate threats and the climate mitigation options, to Nick potentially touching on how these sports representatives can look at the economics of their decisions and how to make smart economic decisions for their business while also keeping safety in mind. So Maddy, I'll put that over to you and would love if everyone could give some input after she answers.
Great. I think any conversation about what can you do about climate change has to start with recognizing what your own organization's climate demands are. And what I mean by that, and Jonathan touched on it, is if you are golf, you need preferably nice weather, you need a green, you need enough space. If you are playing soccer or running or tennis, preferably again, fair weather or nicer weather, enough space, so on and so forth. So when you consider that many of these sports, although they might not be played on the same terrain, have many of the same actual weather demands, you can start to work with each other on trying to figure out what other people are doing about heat, what other organizations might be doing about inclement weather, and you can move forward from that shared climate demand standpoint. A couple of really good resources to understand what might be coming your way in your area that are very, very easy to use. If you're in Canada, climateatlas.ca is a really good resource, and it breaks down province by province some of the more urgent challenges that might be coming in the immediate future and then in 20 years, 30 years, and so on. In the US, they have the same exact website, almost the same. It's called statesAtRisk.org, and you can click on your state and it will tell you what the top risks are. And so if you're, for example, in Wisconsin, you might get extreme heat and it'll tell you when in the summer that's coming. You might get drought, you might get wildfires in certain parts of the north. And again, they'll tell you when in the year you can expect that. If you're in the UK, the Met Office website has climate maps. And again, they offer those same resources. So just having a better idea of what your demands are and then using these resources to know what is coming your way is a really good starting point to just raise awareness in your organization about the challenges you may face and start reaching out to other organizations that may face the same challenges or have already faced the same challenges to learn what they did to respond.
I guess I'll jump in next. I think rather than just saying from an economic perspective, I think that there's a wonderful amount of resources out there for sport organizations, in that you have people like us on the panel and other researchers out there who are doing a lot of work in this area. And I think partnering between academia, community stakeholders, sport organizations, and government is sort of an optimal and maybe a little idealistic, but would be a great way for us to be able to better, I think, not just look and measure what's happening, but try to come up with creative solutions to these problems. You know, there's government databases that are free use that I'm pulling a lot of data on pollution from, and I think a lot of people often are not even aware that there's a monitor literally across the street from their building that could help them better understand what kind of impacts that are happening that would be at no cost to them. Or for very little cost, they could even be getting, you know, people who specialize in it to install cheap monitors to be able to actually better measure some of these impacts. And I think things like this would actually really help us develop a better understanding of what's happening, and then to create the policies to improve or at least mitigate the impacts that sport's having.
I can add in here too. I think we have to put a lot of more focus into sports medicine considerations. There's just going to be ever increasing medical issues related to having to compete in more environmentally challenging conditions. So making sure there's athletic training services available so that there's appropriate health care for the athletes, especially in higher risk sports like American football or soccer or cross-country running, triathlon, things like that. They're just, these kind of changes in climate have a very direct positive correlation with risk.
Great. And Jonathan, any last words for you on that?
I think I might have run out.
All right. Well, it's good timing. We're just about to wrap up. We had some other questions come through which we weren't able to get to, but we will get in touch with you and connect you to the speakers so they can hopefully be answered. And I just want to say another thank you for everyone for joining us, to our speakers and for our listeners, and give a final plug for the last webinar in our Earth Month series, which is taking place next Monday, April 20th. And then a reminder again, as I mentioned at the beginning, for the Digital Resource Fair that we and the Sport Ecology group are launching on Earth Day, which is next Wednesday, April 22nd. And more information about these webinars and the resource fair will be in the follow-up email. So thank you for your time today, and we hope you can join our next discussion. Hope you have a great rest of your day.